All right, so we're going to get started. You got your assignment 104 handout. So as is normal in the class, generally you turn one in, you get the next one. I apologize, I'm behind on the grading. You guys will get the grade sheets next class. I had doubled up grade load because my later class needed their grade sheets too, so I didn't get through everybody. So I apologize for that. Assignment 104, we're going to talk a little bit more about next class. We'll get into more detail. Right now, you don't really have the skills to do it. So we kind of need to get through today, and then you can start kind of thinking about it. So you're going to be creating a little Charlie Harper styled drawing, which is Charlie Harper was an artist in the 50s and 60s. He did a lot of kind of very graphic shapes, most of which are animals or bugs, and we're going to be mimicking his style. It works really nicely with Illustrator in kind of a combination. This assignment, which like I said, we'll talk more about next class, is due on 10/23. So it's a week from, it's a Wednesday. What's today, a Wednesday? It is 2 Wednesdays from now. Sorry, I'm just trying to mentally go through it. And so you guys will have the skills and we'll be able to do it at that point. Today I'm not going to talk too long in lecture format. We're going to spend a lot more time in demo format, and really today is about skill building. We're going to be using the pen tool in Illustrator, which some of you have already kind of played around with the pen tool a little bit in InDesign. The pen tool is available to you in Illustrator. It's available to you in InDesign. It's even available to you in Photoshop. And it's one of the more powerful tools that's available in those programs from Adobe. But it's really hard to get comfortable with. It's hard to be able to work with it and to understand how to draw with it. And so it just takes practice. Back when we had an 18-week semester, I actually spent 2 whole days working on the pen tool, just practicing with the pen tool and getting your skills up with it. We don't have that luxury anymore. It's not my fault. It's the way it works. So you get an extra, whatever it is, 5 minutes today because they compressed it, and you get to work on it during the course of today. So anyway, we'll get to that. But before I get to the demo portion of the pen tool and kind of understanding how the pen tool works, I want to talk about a key thing that's happening in the world of computers when it relates to the Adobe software. And I get the question, and I have received the question in the past, wait a minute, why do we do Illustrator and why do we do Photoshop? And what's the point of working in one software versus the other? Like, I'm really good in Photoshop, let me just keep working in Photoshop. Why do I have to learn Illustrator too? Well, there's a distinct difference between the programs, and it has to do with how they process and work with graphics. And there are 2 types of graphics that are out there that you will come across and that you will work with. One is called a vector graphic, and the other is called a raster graphic. And you have to work with both of those, and frequently you have to work with both of them interchangeably. But I want to explain to you what's kind of the difference between these 2. So raster graphics, which is what you work in Photoshop, which is what you take when you take a digital photograph, is essentially a file that contains a bunch of little colored squares. And the more you zoom in to those colored squares, the more you could see the individual colors. And some of you noticed when you were working on isolating the images, that's usually when you see it, you zoom in to try to get an edge, and suddenly you see all those little colored squares. So we're limited by the resolution, by the number of little colored squares that we have in a particular photograph. Now, we could take a very high resolution photograph and have a lot of detail and be able to blow it up without it becoming too pixelated, without seeing the little squares. But at some level, when you zoom in, it's always going to show those little squares. The advantages would be that you can do pixel by pixel color adjustment. So we worked in Photoshop, we worked with the clone stamp. Take this part of the image, copy it over to here. Just copy those colored squares and put them over here. It works really nicely for that and allows you a lot of flexibility in terms of how you're processing the image, how you enhance the image, what it looks like long term. All those features that are available in Photoshop are really nice. It's much easier to edit when complex color is involved. So you have a little bit of shading, you want to do a little bit of dodging or burning, that's where Photoshop really excels and where it's good, because we're applying whatever changes we're applying to all the pixels, right? Individual colors, we're just making adjustments to those. They also have, if we're dealing with fancy effects, drop shadows and that sort of thing, we could generally apply those artistic effects and whatever. We don't do that too much in this class, but it is much easier to work with. The disadvantage with a raster graphic is that we're limited by that resolution. At some point you zoom in and it becomes blurry. And no matter how big that original image is, you could have a gigapixel image. At some point, if you keep zooming in, it's going to become blurry. And that's a limitation. The raster file sizes are also very, very large. You save a Photoshop file, it gets big. You start working on it, you fill up the scratch disk because you don't have enough space on your computer. It takes more computer processing to deal with it. And that's because there's a bunch of individual little squares. So if we think about a raster file for a second, we have to have information in that file that is pixel 1, this color, pixel 2, this color. And so if we have 12 million pixels, we have to have that information for all 12 million of those little dots. That fills up the file by quite a lot. Vector graphics, on the other hand, are based on mathematical definitions of the particular shape. So we could think of a line as a straight line between two coordinates, 2 points, mathematically defined. We could think of a square. Here's 4 corner points. Fill in what's inside in a color, and everything outside is not that color. 4 data points, and we have the color of the inside region. It's much easier and much less processing power on the computer to do this kind of a graphic. So there's some distinct advantages. Images or graphics are inherently scalable. You can keep blowing them up bigger and bigger and bigger, and they're not going to lose their resolution. They're never going to become blurry because they're defined by mathematics. We just make that bigger and fill the whole region with red, for example. It's much easier on the computer to process because it's simply just a few coordinates and then fill this region in this color and do that with that color. The file sizes tend to also be very, very small. The disadvantages, however, vector images are not good for photographs or images with high complexity color. And I like this example on the right side here because I think it really illustrates my point. So this one is the photograph itself. And you can see there's a lot of nice color ranges, especially like in the cheeks here, like in there, or along the fingers. There's little subtle color ranges, and we can see all the definition of the fingers. If we look at the same 2 regions here, that cheek is all one color. It becomes kind of flat. Likewise, if you look at the fingers here, there's distinct color regions where this is all one color, this is all another color. So it's not really photorealistic anymore because we don't have the subtle gradients that are available in a photograph. So it's different. It's not good for a photograph. Vector graphics are not as universal as raster graphics. It's pretty easy to open a JPEG. You open up a computer, and guess what? You could probably open a JPEG. A vector graphic file, an Illustrator or an EPS file, generally you need some kind of software to read it. And you have to have that software to be able to interact with the file. So when do we use raster graphics versus when do we use vector graphics? So our raster graphics, we're going to use our photographs, our high dynamic range images, our background HDRIs. Those are all in the photograph category or in the raster image category. The vector category are going to be things like line drawings, technical drawings, logos. Right? If you do a logo, you want to be able to put it on a billboard and not have it blurry. You want to be able to put it on a little business card. So you need to be able to use it. The other unsung hero here is fonts. Fonts have to be raster because you've all experienced this. You've all taken the font and you've said, make this font 150 point. The edges aren't blurry. So it has to be a vector graphic. So we have to be able to blow it up as it gets bigger. So fonts and typography are all vector graphics.
So when you export like a logo, what is the best format to export to the?
Generally an EPS. If you want it to be more universal, it's going to be an EPS. A Photoshop file, or excuse me, an Illustrator file is another good one. It depends on how you end up intending to use it later on. So for example, let's say that you were doing a business card and you wanted to use a logo. If you had your logo file as an Illustrator file, you can drop that Illustrator file straight into InDesign where you're doing the business card. So you can take that AI file and drop it straight in, and it will get the full resolution at the size you need it to be. The same thing would happen with an EPS file. So we will, in this class, frequently will end up just exporting as JPEG when we post it. The JPEG would obviously be subject to the raster If we blew it up too much, we'd lose it. But as long as we're working from the vector file, when we're creating the ultimate image, we know we're going to have a high enough resolution for it. So here's an example, and I think this kind of illustrates the point a little bit. So in this particular example, we're looking at this logo here. Doesn't matter what the logo is. And we have the first resolution of 250 by 78. The vector size is 36 kilobytes. The bitmap or rastered size is 57. OK, there's a difference. Those are both small files. Does it really matter? No. But what about when we jump up here to the much bigger size at 1500 by 466? Well, guess what? The vector size is exactly the same. It's still math, still defined by those control points. That's it. We jumped up on the vector or the raster size to a 2 megabyte file just to make it that much bigger. So there's a distinct difference. And again, none of these file sizes matter. They're all small enough to manipulate and to work with. But if we think of this on a much larger scale, we're doing one of the big billboards on the side of the highway where we need huge resolution. This is going to matter and how we process it because of the size of what we're creating. Another example here I think is also good. Same logo. This is all from the same website here, where we've got the 100% view. There it is. Next one over, we blew it up to 1600%. Notice how sharp those lines still are? So we see perfectly sharp edges along the logo. If we took the same logo and we had it rasterized, essentially made it into a raster image, and we blew it up to 1600%, you can see how blurry and pixelated that becomes. So there's a distinct difference. When you want to preserve that resolution, you're going to want to be in vector format. So you guys already work with most of these programs, and they distinctly fall in certain categories. So in the raster, we're dealing with things like Photoshop or photo processing. Any of those software packages that are processing photos are all going to be in raster. The other thing that's very much raster is V-Ray. It's dealing with processing and making full resolution color renderings, for example. So any rendering engine is going to be a raster processor. The vector side of things, we're going to deal with Illustrator extensively in this class, but many of the other design software packages that we work with fall under this category. InDesign technically falls under this category, though InDesign is a little weird because you work with photos in InDesign, so it's a little counterintuitive. Technically, it's vector-based because you're defining the frame and you're just filling it with something. So it's a little bit of a hybrid. AutoCAD, Vectorworks, Revit, Rhino, SketchUp. We can keep going. All those design packages are all vector graphics programs. And if you think about it for a second, it kind of makes sense. Let's say you had a Rhino file. You need Rhino to be able to open it. It's specialized software. You're not going to just be able to open some random computer and open up your Rhino file. It doesn't work. So it's very specific when we get into vector graphics. OK, so I'm going to switch over. I told you that was going to be short. I'm going to switch over, and we're going to talk about Illustrator. We'll introduce the concept or the program of Illustrator, and then we'll get into the pen tool and how we're actually defining these shapes. So bear with me while I switch over for a second. OK, so I've gone ahead and I've switched over. And what we're going to be working with today as a way of practicing the pen tool, and it's really important that I emphasize this. This is about practicing with the pen tool. It's not about actually building a font. The reason that I've picked doing a font is essentially it gives you practice with the pen tool using a bunch of complex shapes that you're already really familiar with. You already know what an A looks like. You already know what a B looks like. Now you're thinking about how do I make that in a particular shape? How do I learn to draw that? It's kind of like in 130. I don't even know if they do this in 130 anymore, where you have those days where you practice lettering all day. You're trying to figure out the proper letter form. How do you actually, what's the stroke order for a B to make it look correct, and that sort of thing. Essentially, that's what we're doing. We're learning tool, learning how to use your pen. So what I have for you is under exercise 113. If you scroll to the bottom, there's a template. It's Illustrator template for exercise 113. You go ahead and download that template, and then you can open it up in Illustrator. There we go. And this is designed to kind of help you get started. So I already have it set up for you, and it gives you kind of a guide so that it's easier to kind of get your feet wet on something like this. I'm going to walk over kind of the general layout of Illustrator. When you open Illustrator, it looks almost identical to InDesign. So it's very, very similar product. In fact, before Adobe even wrote InDesign, before it existed as a program, people did layout work in Illustrator. So much of what we're doing here crosses over. InDesign has gotten a lot better for layout work, so it's preferable to do our layout work in InDesign, but many of the tools are the same, and really Illustrator's gotten a bit better at graphic arts. So they have distinct differences. So with this particular template, as I open it up, I have my typical tools running down the left side. These look very similar to what you saw in InDesign. The key ones to point out here, we have our regular selection tool, the black arrow. We also have our white arrow, the direct selection tool. We're going to use that extensively today. As we come down here, there is the pen tool, not to be confused with the curvature tool right below it. They look very, very similar, but they operate a little bit differently. We're going to work with the pen tool today. So these top three options are really what we're going to be working with today. As we come down here further, there's a text tool. There's a gradient tool. There's a bunch of other examples. We're going to deal a little bit with the width tool, which is available right here. I'll show you that a little bit later on today. And then down here at the very bottom, we do have our fill color and our stroke color. Our fill color is set to white right now, which means that as we draw a shape, it's going to fill in. So if, for example, I started drawing, hold on a second, I got to adjust my layers here. There we go. If I started to draw, you can see that it fills in white in the middle of the shape. I would recommend right now, before we get started, that we change our fill right here, change our fill color to be nothing. So I'm going to make sure I click on the little fill icon, and then I'll click on the red slash that's below it. That will take the fill away. So there is no fill. We're only dealing with our stroke or our line color. That's it. So fill color, click the little red slash, and that goes away. OK, as we come over here, we have our properties. The difference between Illustrator and Photoshop is they've actually taken away our little ribbon at the top that we're used to seeing, and they've moved it all on the right side in the properties window. It's taken me a little bit of time to get used to it. I was used to looking for the ribbon up here. Sometimes the ribbon still shows. If we switched our workspace into one of the other workspaces, it would probably, Essentials Classic, yeah, it gives us that ribbon. So like I said, it's moving over. I'm going to stick with just the regular Essentials for right now because I'm trying to get used to working in the Properties window because that's obviously the way Adobe's working. So we have our Properties window. Things about our particular tool will show up on the right side here in the Properties window. Next one, we have our layers. I've already set up some layers in this file for you, and I'm actually going to change and turn off the Page 2 layer so that I'm seeing page 1, which will allow us to start with the capital A. And I'm going to work through the capitals first. I think it's easier to start with the capitals and then move to the lowercase. This calligrapher template is, and we'll get to this later on in class today, you can actually upload this to their website and they'll create a font from your work for you. That part isn't required for what we're doing today. Really, it's about the pen tool and the practice with the pen tool, so I don't really care whether you end up making it a font. But the reason that this is laid out the way it is and we start with A over here is because it's based on their website. So if you decided to make it a font, you could, as opposed to me just saying, I want you to write all the letters in these squares. So there's a little bit of a carrot, a little bit of a reward. So I went ahead and I turned off page 2. You can turn on and turn off the guides should you want to. I put all the guides on their own layer. I also put a little bit of extra text here so you can see where the cap height, the X height, and the baseline probably should be. Those are guides. If you don't like where I put it, you don't have to do it that way. Your X height doesn't have to be what I suggest. I'm just trying to give you some basic guidelines. So as we look at the layers here, I'm going to be working on page 1. I'm going to leave the guides on, and I want to make sure that the active layer, the one that when I create shapes they're going to appear on, is the font page 1. So I'm going to make sure I click on that and it's highlighted in blue here. With that highlighted in blue, I can go ahead and start drawing these particular characters. I'll switch from the layers over into the properties. And now it's time to start drawing these individual letters. So to do that, I'm going to work with the pen tool. So it's the third option down here. I'll click on the pen tool. There are some other tools underneath the pen tool, like the anchor point tool. We're going to deal with just the pen tool for right now. And as I start to work with the pen tool here, I'm going to come over to A, and I'm going to draw out A. Now, depending on how you draw it, you may start at the top and work yourself down. You may start at the bottom and work yourself up. And we're going to get different results as I do that. If I started up here at the top, say I start here, I'm going to make a single click. I'm going to come down till I'm on the baseline, and I'll make another click right there. That's then created this first line. As I'm doing this, you see that my line wants to continue. Well, I don't really want it to continue because I'm going to go back up to the top and work my way down the other side. So I'll switch to the selection tool and then back to the pen tool to start back over here at the top. Now when I switch back to the pen tool and I hover my mouse over the top of this shape, notice my cursor changes. My pen tool changes to have a little slash next to it. That means I'm going to continue from that point as opposed to starting a new line from that particular point. So I'll click there, and I can now continue to draw the second half of my shape. So at this point, I have to determine, where this A belongs. Maybe it's about like that. Again, when I'm done, I'm going to switch back up to the selection tool, and now I've finished. So one thing to point out, I'm going to keep clicking pen tool and then selection tool to end. You can reach the selection tool by pressing the V on the keyboard, which will make it a lot quicker. So whenever you're looking at one of these, see how it says selection tool and then in parentheses V? That's the keyboard shortcut. I don't like to use the keyboard shortcuts because you guys can't necessarily see what I'm pressing, so I try to make sure that I click. The pen tool is P, so I can switch back and forth. I could go to V for selection, P for pen, and back and forth like that. So it's faster to get used to working that way, but like I said, I'm not going to do it on the screen because it's harder for you guys to see. So I've gone ahead and I've drawn this part of the A. Now it's time to draw the crossbar for the A. So let me zoom in a little bit to take a look at this here. Now, when I hover over my existing line, see how my pen tool adds a little plus sign next to it? That's actually adding a control point on this line as opposed to starting a new line. So if I were to click, say, here, it's not going to start with a line for me. So I really need to be slightly off of my existing line and then come across. And when I'm coming across, I can actually end on top of the line. And then again, I'm going to go back to the selection tool. So my line isn't quite long enough to end on this particular line. You guys see that little gap there? So I need to go in and I need to adjust it. The regular selection tool, the black arrow, if I were to click my line, it gives me a bounding box, and then I can actually extend my line by dragging it and moving it that way. So I can move it over to me. The other option that I have, however, is I can go in using the direct selection tool, the white arrow, and I can choose just the end point of the line. So just this point, and I can then move just that point until it comes over and intersects. So the advantage of the direct select, the white arrow, is that you can always go and adjust an individual endpoint or control point. So I've done that letter. Let me zoom back out here. That's my A. We'll come back and make some adjustments to the thickness of the line and whatever. I'm going to do that, but I'm first concentrating on the pen tool. So the next one, let me just scroll down. I'll do the letter H. Again, I'll use my pen tool, and we'll start with a straight line. I'll go back to the regular selection tool, then back to the pen tool, and we will draw the second line. We'll come back to the pen tool, and I'll draw the same strategy here where I'll draw my crossbar. I'll come back to the direct select, select that endpoint, and pull it over until it's on top. And now I've drawn the H. So straight shapes are relatively easy, right? Click, click, we draw a straight line. What happens when we start to get into some of the shapes that have some curvature. So we'll look, I'm going to do the D, letter D first. I'm skipping around a little bit because I'm increasing in difficulty as I go through. So if I were to do the letter D, the first thing I would do is, again with the pen tool, I would draw the back of the letter D. So I'd come straight down there. There's the back of my letter D. Now when I come out here, I could, do some kind of a letter that looked like that. But what if I want it to curve? If I want it to curve, I'm going to, instead of just making a single click, I'm going to click and hold and then drag. And what that does is it gives me a tangent line for my particular curve, and I can then adjust what that curve looks like. The longer I drag it, the more curvature I get. The shorter it is, the less curvature I get. So I'm going to drag it out here to right about there, and that's then forming that part of my arc. And then I can come back up to the top. Notice that when I go back over my line here, it's giving me that little circle. That means it's closing the shape. And I can click there. And I've now created that D. Now if I don't like what the D looks like, I can go with the direct select tool. I can go back to that point right there, and I can adjust this anchor. I could say, you know what, I want the bottom of the D to be a little bit further down, or I want this point not to be in the center. I want to pull the whole thing down, and I want to shorten that up like that, depending on the style of the letter that you're looking for. So I can always adjust and manipulate the curvature based on those tangent lines. I can also adjust the tangent lines independently of each other. So I can make the top, by clicking and holding, bigger or smaller without affecting the bottom, in this case, like that. So let's move over, and I'll try the letter B. So on the letter B, I'm going to go back to the pen tool. I'll start, and I'll draw the back of the letter B. There it is. Now in this scenario, I have two loops to try to connect. So I'm going to go ahead and come out here, click, hold, drag to create the first part of the letter. So we'll say it's about like that. And then I'll come back. So there I was on top of my line, and it gave me the add anchor point. I just want to be close to it. We'll say like that. I'll go back up to my selection tool, then back to my pen tool. I'll start again at the top this time. I'll draw the top of the letter, click, hold, drag, like that, and then I'll come down to right there. I'll go back to the direct select tool, zoom in a bit, take those endpoints right there and pull them over until they match. Now again, I can manipulate these. I can make this longer. I can make this one come up higher if I wanted to, depending on the size of what we were after. I'm not going to do it that way. I'm going to leave it like that. That seems reasonable. Sometimes you want these to be pushed out. Let me delete this here. And I'll do it again. I'll use the pen tool. I'll draw the backbone first. I want to come out flat for a bit and then draw my arc. And I want it to go flat. That. Same thing this time. Pen tool here. Come out flat. Then go into my arc. And come back down. Now this one I didn't do as good of a job, so I need to go in with the direct select tool and manipulate. This needs to come down a bit. This needs to get taller. That needs to come down a little bit more. I want this to come up to meet that. I want this one to be straight, and we'll pull it over. I want that to bulge out a little bit. And so you can see I can work through and kind of manipulate the curvature. So we get to the letter C. So this one's also pretty hard. We're increasing that difficulty. So on the letter C, the temptation is, okay, well, I'm going to start right about here, and I'll do another point, say, here, and I'll do another point here, and I'll do another point here, and I'll do another point here, I'll do another point there, and I'll do another point there. And so you look at this and you're like, ew, that doesn't look very good. So a couple things. One, if you're going to draw a shape completely freehand, the fewer control points you have, the better. So I have way too many control points down at the bottom here, and that's part of what's giving me that shape. So if I were to draw this by hand, I would start here, maybe make one control point there, one control point along the backside, one control point at the bottom, and one control point where it ends. And then I'd have to go back with the direct select and start to manipulate and say, you know, where do I want this? Should that be curving as much as it is? Should this be a little bit shorter? Should it curve down a little bit more? And eventually you can get it to look reasonable. So the fewer the points you have, the better. The other strategy, though, is to, instead of trying to draw the whole thing freehand, is to actually use some of your shapes to your advantage. So I'll come in here, and instead of the rectangle tool, I'm going to use the ellipse tool. And I will draw in an ellipse that's at the correct size. And then I want to actually trim out part of this to make the opening of the C. So you notice this is nice and smooth. It's done a great job. So let me go in to my pen tool here. And with the pen tool selected, when I hover over my curve, you see how I get that little plus sign next to it. It's easier to see at the bottom here. See that little plus sign? That's adding an anchor point. So I'm going to add an anchor point where I want the bottom of the C to be. So we'll put it there. And I'll add an anchor point up here where I want the top of the C to be. There. And you see that when I do it, it gives me the tangent. Then I'll use the direct select tool, the white arrow, and I'm going to select the point that's in between this point and this point. So in that case, it is that point right there. I'll select that point and then press the delete key on the keyboard. And when you delete that control point, it deletes the two line segments that are attached to it. So I delete the control point, it gets rid of the line segments that go from here to the point and there to the point. If, and I wouldn't do this on this particular letter, but if I wanted to remove just the section of the line, let's say from there to there, I would need to actually create a third control point right in the middle of those two to be able to delete that section. So it's always two control points and then one in the center. If it already exists, that's great. If it doesn't exist, you have to create it. I'm going to go back and undo it. So if I zoom out for a second, we see that I've already done A, B, C, and D. E and F, perfectly easy. We'll go back to the pen tool. All right, we come straight down. We draw out. We draw there. We'll go back to the pen tool. We draw the top of the E. Say it's like that. You guys get the idea. F, very, very similar. In fact, I would probably take this shape that I just drew plus this crossbar. There you go. I'll copy it, Control C, Control V gives me a paste of it. I'll come over to F. Now in this scenario, I want to get rid of this bottom segment. So I can click on the direct select tool, select the end point right there. And I'm going to, when I press delete, I'll get rid of the end point and the line that's attached to it, which would be the bottom. And suddenly I have the F. So don't be afraid to copy your letters. Likewise, a G, I could take the C that I already have. Let me make sure I do it with the black arrow, the selection tool here. Control C, Control V, that gives me the C. Oops. Which I can put over here in G. And then I can go back to the pen tool, start here. I could come straight up and over to create the rest of that G, assuming I wanted the G to look that way. Okay, so we're going to keep moving on. Right, I, J, etc. You guys can work through that. O would be just a circle. You see where we're coming. Suddenly we get to the letter S. There's no great way of doing the letter S, but I will show you a couple strategies. First one, do it freehand, in which case you're using the pen tool. You're choosing where to start. Remember, as few control points as possible. So I'm starting here, control point at the top, probably. control point at the back side, right there, control point in the middle of the S, so right about there, control point right here, control point at the center of the bottom, right about there, and then we end our S right there. In all likelihood, you're going to have to go back and make some adjustments. That one didn't turn out too badly, but I'll go back and I'll make some adjustments. Maybe this needs to come up a little bit more. Maybe that needs to come up a little bit more. Maybe this needs to get a little bit shorter. And if you work at it, you'll be able to actually create a reasonably good looking S. The alternative to that would be to build it out of some shapes. So let me go ahead and use the regular selection tool here. I'll press delete. I'll use the ellipse tool again. And in this scenario, I'm going to create an ellipse for the top of the S. And I'm going to create another ellipse for the bottom of the S. So I have an ellipse there and an ellipse there. So if we think about the S, I want to break the ellipse right here, start it, come around, continue down to the bottom, and break it over here. So in that scenario, I'll use the pen tool again. I'll add a control point right there. Then I'm going to go, oops, sorry about that. Pen tool, I have to make sure I get that little plus icon. Oh, come on. And try going directly to the anchor point tool. There we go. Oh. Come on. You used to have, there it is. Sorry, for some reason it wasn't letting me pick. There it is. So I've added the anchor point. Then I'll use my direct select and select this point here and press the delete key. That gives me an arc now that comes down and stops right there. I'm going to do the same thing on the other side. So we'll add my pen tool here. There we go. And I'll figure out where I want that S to end. So say it ends right there. I'll go back with my direct select, my white arrow, click on this point, and then press the delete key. And so I was able to create the top of the S and the bottom of the S in a much more controlled manner. It's easier to do it that way. If, however, I zoom in, we see that there's a gap between this point and that point at the center. So I need to be able to bring those 2 points together. I'll use the direct select tool, and I'll select both. I'm dragging a box around this so that I'm selecting both endpoints, there and there. At this point, I can look over at my properties, and you see right here under the anchors, there's an option to connect selected endpoints. If I click on that option, it will connect those two together and make it one continuous curve. These two give me a little straight section in there. If I wanted that to go away, I could go back to my pen tool, hover over this point, and actually delete the anchor point there. It changed the curvature here, though. So that might not be the most advantageous thing. It might be better to leave those 2 points. So when we talk about manipulating these points, let me go back to the letter D, for example. If I came down and I drew the letter D like this, I can take this point, which currently has a sharp corner to it, and I can actually convert it so that it has an arc instead of being an angular point. So I could say, let's convert it to being an arc. Then I get a tangent line, and I can adjust the tangent there and there, for example. I could take that same point, and I could convert it back to being angular by clicking on this. So I can convert between smooth and corner points if I want to. I could also take any one of these points, I'll use this point, and I could break the lines at that point, which would give me individual control over the 2 endpoints. So instead of being a connected line, I now have 2 individual points. So that's a way of breaking it apart. So what I haven't dealt with just yet is the stroke, or the thickness of the lines. So if I take my regular selection tool, my black arrow, and I click on this S, for example, when I click on that S, I see over here under Appearance that I have the ability to change the stroke thickness, or the line thickness. If I increase it, my line's going to get thicker, like that. So maybe 6 point, a little bit thicker. I can do the same thing to one of my other letters. Let's take the letter C here, for example. I could change the stroke up to maybe 6 points. There are other options for my stroke, and let me do it with the letter D in this example. Let me click and make that 6 point. And if I click on the text that says stroke here, it brings up more options. So this controls how the corners look. It controls where, and I'll do these caps at the letter A so you can see it. But the corner here, right there, I currently have it as a sharp corner. I could round the corners. See how that corner becomes rounded? I could also bevel the corners if I wanted to. I could clip the corners. It's just a style decision. The align strokes really doesn't matter too much. It just has to do with whether the fill is centered on your line, inside your line, or outside your line. We'll come down here and deal with the dashed line, and I'll also talk about profile in just a little bit. Let me show you the letter A, because I think this one's always a useful one to show. Let me select my line here. I'm going to increase thickness to 6. I'll click on stroke, and now we can deal with cap. So right now, the lines end right there. If I wanted to round the ends, I could choose to round the ends. I could also choose to extend the ends past where the end of the line would be. So those are just other options. Likewise, on the corner here, I could choose to round the top. So in this scenario, I could round the top and the sides, and we'd get rounded and rounded, which may or may not be a style that you're after. Okay, so let me select that again. There it is. I'll go back to stroke. I'm going to go back to my square corners and my sharp point there. And the next thing that we can use is something called the width tool, which is right here. It kind of looks like a slug, for lack of a better term. The width tool allows me to adjust the width along the course of a line independently. So with the width tool on the letter A here, I can pick any point along the path, click, hold, and come on, width tool. Helps if I actually pick the width tool. There we go. Any point along the path, click, hold, and drag, and I can control the width at that particular location. So I can make the width narrower, like that. I could also make the width fatter in that particular location. So let's say that I made the width a little bit narrower here, like that. I could take the same width and I can make it narrower on this side. And I could take this one and I could make it a little bit fatter. And suddenly I'm changing what that letter looks like using the width tool. I could do the same thing over here for the letter B. So let me start by taking the whole letter and upping the stroke so we can see it a little bit thicker. There it is at 6 point. I can come back to the width tool and I can choose where I want this to get fat or where I want it to get narrow. Maybe I want it to be fatter there and fatter there, and I want it to be thinner in that section. This end point here I'm going to have to work on, etc. So I can control where that width occurs at the corners. You guys get the idea. So I have a lot of flexibility. Those are all manually adjusting the width. If I select the line itself, again, and over here on the right, if I go to stroke and I come down here to profile, these are all profiles of that width. So I can pick one of the preset profiles and see what one of those presets look like. You can kind of cycle through them as a different set of strategies. So you can use that as well. Like that. We have the ability to install brushes, though I'm not going to talk about brushes until a little bit later. So if you feel comfortable and you want to put brushes on, you can. It's not necessary at this point. I would encourage you to just work with the pen tool and just work with the width tool as your options. So really today is all about practice. When you're done with the first set of letters, and you made it, there we go, you've made it through all the uppercase letters on the first page, go back to Layers, turn on page 2, turn off the page 1 letters that you already drew, move up to the font page 2, and continue on with your letters. I would do all the letters first, followed by the numbers. So start with the capital letters, work your way through. Don't be afraid to pick and choose your letters. If the F's and the H's and the E's are easy for you, do those first. And work your way into the letter S, for example, as being the most difficult. Today is really about practicing. You need to be very comfortable with the pen tool long term. It's going to be your best friend. It's also really hard to get used to it. It's hard to get used to the click drag, how big the tangent should be, where should the tangent point be when I'm creating something. But all of that's going to help you when you work in Illustrator long term. So I'm going to let you guys start working. If you have any questions, let me know. We'll cover more topics in Illustrator as we go forward in the class, but today is all about the pen tool. Get that practice in. I expect that you can, however far you get is fine, but I expect you to be here working till the end of class. If you finish all the letters and all the numbers, do the punctuation, etc. So keep working your way through. Yeah?
Is there a hotkey to long a line on the axis?
That's a good question. Typically in Illustrator there's not a hotkey, but it will do it automatically. So as I start to move the mouse, let me zoom in so you can kind of see this. So I started with a control point. As I come and swing to being almost in line, it jumps to that line so I know where it is. So there you can kind of feel it when it hits. There you go. So just move your mouse until it gets close and then it will do it. You don't actually hold down Shift or anything like that. It's built into the guides.